Hey guys, I'm going to talk today about colorful personality who has come into this sphere of Holocaust denial named Ryan Faulk, or the alternative hypothesis. Faulk is a social media personality, Twitterer and so on, who presents himself as a bold nerd who thoroughly, painstakingly researches historical and contemporary topics, and he debunks basically woke or liberal establishment memes on race and the history of World War II and so on. This branding of his as an industrious nerd is mere bluster. As I'll show, he is a deeply lazy and superficial individual who draws his worldview from the empty-headed memes of the internet gutter. Like, we're talking image board level. The branding is a total fraud. So my series on him is going to focus on his views on World War II. He denies German responsibility for starting the war and denies any German aggression against Chechnya, which is quite humorous, as we'll get to. This video specifically will focus on a simple premise which Faulk continually uses to justify his Holocaust denial, and that is that all Holocaust claims, meaning mass murder, gassing, mass killing, and so on, are founded on evidence produced by the Soviet Union, especially after the war. In other words, Alt Hyp contends the Soviet Union fabricated evidence for the Holocaust after the war. More specifically, he alleges that gas chambers were a hoax, and that this hoax is borne out by the fact that the only homicidal gas chambers, in his claim, not mine, were found by the Red Army. And to boost the plausibility of his claims in this regard, Hype claims that the Holocaust was essentially covered up during the war until the Soviets liberated the death camps and then supposedly fabricated the evidence for it. His claim is that the Holocaust was fabricated by the Soviet Union. I'm going to discredit that on three grounds. First, I'm going to point out that the evidence for the Holocaust did not emerge with the Soviet Union, but emerged with the Polish government in exile, primarily, and was widely known by Allied and Axis governments alike during the war. Second, in response to the claim that, the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, the big extermination camp, how can we trust them? Well, the Western Allies, the British and the Americans specifically, carried out independent investigations without the Soviets involving whether there were gassings at Auschwitz and concluded there were. Through the Belsen trial and the IG Farben trial, these Western nations, the judicial systems concluded there were gassings. This was not just investigated by the Red Army. And third, actually the Western Allies did liberate camps that had gassings, gas chambers, and mass killings. For example, the Natzweiler concentration camp, where 86 Jews were killed in 4 days, that gas chamber is intact today. The gas chambers at Mauthausen, where thousands were killed during the Holocaust, in groups of many dozens at a time. I think it could be up to 80. And also the gas chambers at Hartheim Castle, which were not only used to kill the victims of the so-called euthanasia program, but thousands of concentration camp inmates, including Jews and Poles, so inmates from Dachau and Mauthausen. So, okay, let's get into my first point against the Alt Hyp's claim that the Soviets fabricated the Holocaust, and that is the Polish government in exile, not the Soviet Union, the Polish government in exile, was the first really to raise broad public awareness about the Holocaust, especially through the publication of the booklet, The Mass Extermination of Jews in German-Occupied Poland, in early 1943. The Americans and the British were well aware of the extermination of the Jews during the war. There's scholarship such as Richard Breitman's Official Secrets, as well as Bernard Wasserstein's Britain and the Jews of Europe, 1939-1945, conclusively demonstrates their awareness. The British, particularly because of their decodes, had this knowledge at hand. The Axis knew about and believed the Holocaust was going on. So I'm talking Hitler's allies, Italy, Hungary, Romania, the leaders of these countries. For instance, there was an intelligence report produced by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs on 4 November 1942, and it was actually notated, as seen by Mussolini and Ciano, regarding the Jews sent to the east from the German-occupied zone of France, that they are, quote, eliminated by means of toxic gas. The Hungarian regent Horthy declared in a Crown Council meeting on 19 March 1944, Hitler was furious with him because Horthy was not allowing the Jews to be taken to Germany and killed in extermination camps or killed in Hungary. To quote what Horthy said, Hitler protested to me about Hungary not taking the necessary steps against the Jews. Our crime is, therefore, that I have not fulfilled Hitler's wish and have not allowed the Jews to be massacred. Horthy is saying Hitler's wish is for the Jews to be massacred in a meeting whose minutes were recorded. Not a post-war Soviet invention. Horthy saying during the war, Hitler's wish is for the Jews to be massacred. In this, we're going to have to ask Alt Hyp, what do you make of the fact that other Axis leaders believed in the Holocaust and the extermination of the Jews? They may not have used that term at the time. Ooh, good point. But they knew about the extermination of the Jews. What do you make of that? If the Holocaust is truly a dumb conspiracy theory, a propaganda invention of the Soviets, as you say, Why did Hitler's own allies believe in it? Far from being a propaganda invention of the Soviet Union, ironically, the Holocaust was a subject the Soviets frequently censored and very seldom discussed. The subject is explored in great nuance in Kirill Pfefferman's book, Soviet Jewish Stepchild, The Holocaust and the Soviet Mindset, 1941 to 1964. And Pfefferman shows that there were some periods during the war and post-war where the Soviet officials did publicly acknowledge exterminations, but these were far and few between. And they also sometimes allowed public discussion of it, but again, the general Soviet tendency, according to Pfefferman and all the evidence, was to suppress and censor mention of the Holocaust. And why did the Soviets do this? Why did they want to censor evidence and discussion of the Jewish genocide? They did this because they wanted to serve their propaganda narrative of the war, according to which Soviet citizens in general, and not Jews specifically, were the primary victims of Nazism. They had the crown of victimhood. In fact, Stalin only mentioned the Holocaust once during the war. It's a 6 November 1941 speech which commemorates the anniversary of the October Revolution, and Stalin says the Nazis are engaged in medieval-style Jewish pogroms akin to that of the Tsar. And following Stalin's lead, wartime Soviet propagandists frequently obscured the fact that Jews were uniquely targeted by the Nazis. For example, a 29 November 1941 Pravda article on the notorious Babi Yar massacre obscured the fact that Jews were targeted by the massacre. It said that not only Jews, but Russians and Ukrainians were massacred. And this line, again, very misleading, trying to diminish the fact that Jews are the unique victims here overwhelmingly, this line is repeated by Molotov in a diplomatic communique sent to all nations, which the Soviet Union has relations on 6 January 1942. And this practice of obfuscating the fact that Jews were singled out by the Nazis and instead of obscuring their atrocities to saying, oh, it's just Soviet citizens being killed. This practice continued throughout the war. The most notorious episode was the Pravda article on the liberation of Auschwitz, written by Boris Pelevoy on 2 February 1945. This did not mention the Jews, and nor did reports published on the May 1945 reports of the Soviet investigation to Auschwitz, nor did these published reports of the investigation mention Jews. So, of course, they mentioned the fact that the Nazis were exterminating people at Auschwitz. They didn't mention Jews. Specifically, were singled out as the overwhelming majority of the victims. The Soviet Union also actively worked to censor mention of the German extermination policy. Not only did they not talk about it themselves, but they censored mention of it. So the Black Book of Polish Jewry, published in 1943, was censored in the Soviet Union. And after the war, several important scholarly and artistic works were either on Babi Yar, on the Holocaust, were either suppressed or distorted by Soviet censors. And most interestingly, I think, in this connection, take the 4 million plaque on Auschwitz, which was a propaganda narrative that 4 million died at Auschwitz. The plaque doesn't mention Jews. So this plaque, which is, of course, a lie, in terms of the number and also in terms of lying by omission about the fact that who was the overwhelming victim. This plaque is of a piece with the general Soviet practice of obscuring the fact that Jews were singled out for the most thorough extermination by the Nazis. So as I mentioned, Pfefferman's book goes into detail about the Soviet Union's policy on mentions of the Holocaust, but here, and it's complicated, there's some caveats, as I said, to his argument, but here it suffices to say that the Soviets seldom mentioned the Holocaust, the extermination of Jews, during and the aftermath of the war, and often censored it. And regarding the Alt Hyp's argument that the Soviet Union fabricated the Holocaust as a propaganda weapon, it is completely absurd to say the Soviet Union would take the colossal risk to destroy its credibility internationally by doing this. Why would they create this propaganda weapon and then not use it and ban others from using it? Makes absolutely no sense. Second point, the British and the Americans both investigate Auschwitz after the war. I'm talking about like forensic investigations in terms of like chemical testing or whatever. But I'm talking about they investigate allegations of gassing at Auschwitz, right? And they did this independent of the Soviet Union. The first procedure in which this happened was the first Belsen trial, which was conducted by the British without the Soviets and without anyone else for that matter, between September and December 1945. And because this is a Belsen trial, so you might think, what does that have to do with Auschwitz? Well, because many leading personnel whom the British arrested at Belsen, including the Commandant Josef Kramer, the Belsen women's warden, Greza, Fritz Klein, who was a Nazi doctor, Elizabeth Fulkenroth, others. These people had previously worked at Auschwitz. The British investigated in the Belsen trial allegations of gassing at Auschwitz, and they found that these allegations were true. Interestingly, they also investigated claims of gassing at Belsen, and though it was repeated, I think, once by some lawyer in the trial, the British concluded that there was no gassing at Belsen. It's made up, not true, right? Not true, as I'm showing on the screen. They concluded that it was not true. The British investigated claims of gassing at Belsen and Auschwitz, conclude Auschwitz is true, Belsen was false. Contrary to Alt Hyp's meme that, we're all going off of the Soviets and going off of rumors and so on. And similarly, the Americans conducted an investigation which considered and verified allegations of gassing in Auschwitz. This was namely the IG Farben Trial, 27 August 47 to 30 July 1948. Auschwitz was relevant in the IG Farben Trial because IG Farben supplied Zyklon B to Auschwitz and also financed the Bunawerka factory at Auschwitz III monolith. They were implicated in the extermination process, and pursuant to this, one had to investigate whether there actually was extermination at Auschwitz. And the Americans looked into this question, and they concluded Auschwitz was an extermination camp where Jews were systematically gassed. The British and the Americans' individual trials, which assessed claims of gassing at Auschwitz right after the war and found them to be true. Third point against Alt Hyp's ridiculous claim that the Holocaust is a Soviet invention or based on Soviet evidence only. He wants you to think that all the evidence of gassing and mass killing is from camps liberated by the Red Army. That's fucking not true. The Western Allies liberated camps where mass killings and gassings occurred. Let me repeat. The Western Allies liberated camps where mass killings, massacres, and gassings occurred. Now, it's certainly true, and this is what I'll mention in the follow-up question portion of the video at the very end, certainly true, but the most extensive and systematic mass killings and gassings occurred in camps in occupied Poland, which were liberated by the USSR. The ruins of them were a case of like Treblinka. First example of a camp liberated by the Western Allies, which I'll mention, is Natzweiler. Natzweiler is a striking example because not only is the documentary record of gassing so comprehensive, but the gas chamber is still intact today. Like, you can go visit this. We have records from Dr. August Hirt of the Strasbourg Anatomical Institute, clearly showing he wanted to murder Jews for some kind of cracked scientific experiment to get a skull collection of Jews. It's that these people are that ridiculous. The documents we have proving the gassing at Natzweiler and the existence of this bizarre experiment include requests from Dr. Hirt seeking permission to do the study, a response to Dr. Hirt from the SS agreeing to do the study and send Jews to Natzweiler to be killed, work orders for the repurposing of a room in Natzweiler into a gas chamber, construction documents about the repurposing of the room, documents about the arrival of 86 Jews in the camp who were sent from Auschwitz, confirmation of the simultaneous deaths of all these Jews shortly after their arrival in Natzweiler, and the transportation of the corpses to Dr. Hirt's lab at the Strasbourg Anatomical Institute. By the way, these victims were autopsied, I think, by the French, and certainly the pictures of the gas bodies were found by the Western Allies after the war. Over 4 days, these 86 people were killed by gassing. I call that mass killing. Another such example is the Mauthausen camp. This camp was liberated by the U.S. Army, and it had a gas chamber in which thousands of people were killed in the Holocaust. Dozens at a time could be gassed. I think up to 80 could be gassed in this particular facility. Contrary to what Alt Hyp suggests, neither Western historians nor Western investigators debunked allegations of gassing at Mauthausen. There was a trial done by the Americans, and numerous witnesses attested to the gassing, and people were convicted and sentenced to death. There also are other camps and other facilities were liberated by the West that had gas chambers, and also people who were gassed. So take Dachau, for example. Now, at the camp itself, almost certainly nobody was gassed. There's only one witness to this, and he's confused and contradictory, so it's just not considered credible by historians. As I mentioned earlier, thousands of Dachau inmates were sent to the euthanasia facility at Hartheim Castle and gassed there. Hartheim, by the way, was captured by the Americans, investigated by the U.S. Army. So again, we have another case of a facility that had gassings that was investigated by the Western Allies, not the Soviets. Hyp has promoted this absurd claim that, belief in the Holocaust is arbitrary because if you believe in the evidence for gassings at Auschwitz, for example, or Natzweiler, then you also have to believe in gassings at camps like Dachau and Belsen. This is just fucking ridiculous. There's zero documentary evidence gassing at Dachau compared to this exhaustive documentary evidence of gassings at Natzweiler, and I could provide also exhaustive evidence of gassings at Auschwitz. The Western Allies and even the Axis knew about the extermination of the Jews during the war, and the Soviet Union, far from inventing it as a propaganda weapon, suppressed and distorted mention of the extermination of the Jews. I showed that the Western Allies investigated claims of gassing at Auschwitz and confirmed them after the war. Why did the camps with the most gassings by far, the most victims, the most systematic gassings, why were they all liberated by the Red Army? The reason that the Soviets liberated the major death camps is because the major death camps were in Poland. And this was no coincidence. The vast majority of gassed Jews were Polish Jews. Camps were built in Poland for obvious logistical reasons rather than in Denmark or France or Germany or the Netherlands. Common sense that the Soviets would be in a position to liberate camps in Poland when the Allies, despite the invasion of southern Italy and so on, never really established a Western front until the Normandy landings. Obviously, it makes sense they were in Poland. That's where the Jewish victims were. And it makes sense that the Red Army liberated them because the Western Allies were in no position to do that, having just established a second front. The Alt Hyp just doesn't do his homework. So he promotes these memes, but these memes he'd know were totally hollow if he had done his homework. Maybe he's lying, maybe he's just lazy, but regardless, he's a mediocrity. And his whole brand is an attempt to recast social awkwardness and geekiness as intellectualism. This is just part one. I'm going to tackle his other content in my subsequent videos, and then we'll move on to other Holocaust-related topics. You can look at Twitter to see more updates about my content. History Speaks on Twitter. I'm going to be having a debate with Thomas Dalton in the near future. Look at Twitter for details of that, and I'll also be covering all kinds of different historical subjects related to World War II and other matters. So thank you for listening, guys. Take care. Friend or foe, I wish you a nice day.